that one. Okay. Ay, ay, ay.
I'd like to call the meeting to order of the Land Development Code Committee. Being that everybody is here, we have a quorum. And then order of business. Right, so the next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. Second. Favor? Aye. Any opposed? Right, this is the time for public comment. Is there any public comment? All right, seeing none, we will move to items, which is a presentation by Keenan Associates.
I just want to introduce to you our consultant, Eliza Harris of Keenan Associates, the process for the land development code changes and basically rewrite that whole through that process.
Hi again, everyone. My name is Eliza Harris, Julia Eliza Harris. I'm a principal with Keenan Associates. I've been out on public and private projects, but with a major focus on design codes, which is what we're doing. So I know you've had a couple of meetings in the last meeting that we focused on the content, and this is really intended to give a high purpose of the project is how we're looking at how we believe the community fits in. So to start with kind of basics, we know that there's a variety of folks intentionally on the committee with different direct experience with the code, and some of them may or may not have worked with codes in other jurisdictions. So I wanted to start with the basics. What do codes do? Well, the reason we focused on the comprehensive plan last meeting is because a big part of the code is implemented. The comprehensive plan gives big picture principle steps, but the land development code is where rubber meets the road, where the very specific steps to implement and measure start to be mapped. And that's intentional because the code is meant to be and provide some flexibility within the code around how that gets implemented. One example of that is typically there are broad future land use categories where there can be more specific zoning districts that give city council some leeway in terms of, yes, this is the larger downtown transition downtown transition future land use, but within that there may be different zoning districts that deal with more specific adjacencies. I mentioned earlier flexibility. It also is important to provide some flexibility in the code to deal with specific opportunities or specific sites that have weird shapes or have space or just opportunities, so that you can always go back to the comp plan and say, developer proposed a way to accomplish the goals in the comprehensive plan and just use a different approach that the specific measurements and standards in the code didn't anticipate. And overall, one of the goals of the code is to allow new development while maximizing the community benefits and minimizing. And one thing that we'll probably talk a lot about is how things affect transportation. So how it's such that, one of the goals of the comprehensive development, how do we design buildings such that they walk, which reduces the number of car trips out there at locations. So how the code gets more specific on taking those big picture goals, very specific standards that staff can use when reviewing plans. And just to give a sense of, again, kind of the difference, what is in the comprehensive plan and what the code goal, I just want to do a few pictures. So both of these images, there are some differences between them in terms of that use hits the ground, in the number of driveways, in terms of how close those buildings are to the street. And, a transportation perspective, for instance, I look at these and see curb cuts, which interrupt the sidewalk on the left, whereas there's only one curb cut on the right. So that's kind of a practical aesthetic preferences between different types of development, which we can discuss as we move along this. But again, the big picture is how do we meet those levels? Another example, both the same use, convenience store, very different contexts and very different design. Is in more of a commercial area. Right is actually embedded in a residential community. The one on the left is built with the assumption that most of the customers will be driving there. The one on the right is built with the expectation that most walking there. So where in Oviedo is one of these more appropriate than the other, or which of these is more appropriate in the places that you want to see? A higher density, and some similar concepts. Roughly similar densities. I did not go out and measure roughly the same heights and densities, whereas kind of different architectural style in this case, as well as different citing standards that they may have gone into. So I'm going to stop for questions. So this is the first stop. There'll be more, but anything that. So as I mentioned last time, you talked about the comprehensive plan. One thing I did want to take a step back a little bit further. As part of putting together a comprehensive plan, the city put together a vision and worked with the vision that informed the comprehensive plan. And I wanted to touch on some of those goals that were created as part of that. And I'm not going to go into too much detail. If you really want hours of YouTube presentations, or 3 hours of presentations on YouTube that were given as part of that. Just some of the work that came out as they were working with city staff council of how they saw it would be evolving in the future, words like sustainability, connectivity, urban, walkable. Where they landed was with these higher qualities of future development within the city. But again, if you want to get into detail on these, I'm happy to talk more about any of them, or you can look at that YouTube, which they actually spend a little bit of time on topics. But mixed-use development, connectivity, transportation capacity, multimodal transportation, compact infill development, complete vibrancy, sense of place. Smart as in technology, integrating technology into the urban environment, and design, or the aesthetics of new development. Anyone want to touch on any specific element here on?
Compact infill and complete streets.
Sure. So compact infill typically means higher density development and lines are connected. So usually we think about development as higher density development that is designed such to walk between uses. It's often current with mixed use development as opposed to more traditional suburban styles where you have the multifamily over here, or the center and the shopping center across the highway. Complete streets, again, there's a lot of overlap there with multimodal, how we design streets that are comfortable and safe for people to drive on, walk on, or bike on. That may also be bus. But for our purposes, it'll figure about how developers design the streets within their developments. Again, that also relates to transportation. And staff can also jump in if there's any more than that, but typically that's what they were talking about. So the more you have streets that are connected as opposed to dead ends, that tends to often major roads. If you have everything that is a cul-de-sac, not necessarily typically the cul-de-sac that you imagine, but a community that has out or two entrances that load onto the same roadway, that means that everyone who leaves that development for any reason has to go on that main road. So that creates a lot of traffic on that main road.
And Madam Chair, if I can add that, so connectivity for us is important because in a suburban pattern, usually you have, as the lines of communities are almost like they function as beautiful, the Kingsbridge West has only one entrance. That entrance is blocked, that whole neighborhood. But what we want to do is not only what matters to ours that we have on the streets, but how we manage works for that. So if we can have a green start now to go back and retrofit all those neighborhoods, the connectivity, trying to improve connectivity wherever we can, even out the distance to be taught.
Options on both how to travel, if they have to drive, bike, or walk, as well as which route actually. In fact, not today, but the first time I traveled up here for me, actually on one of the major roads I was coming in on. Again, this conversation is primarily about new development, so particularly as you're talking about that compact infill are important. Not necessarily talking about going back and retrofitting opportunities for that with bike trails and pedestrian. And then how that vision translated into future land use. These are the two major goals for the future land use section. The underlined sections are the sections that were rewritten. So you can see goal 1 was almost completely rewritten. Really focus on, again, things you've heard already. Also, improving the quality of the natural and built environment. So goal 2 actually hasn't changed that much, but we can always go back and look even existing policies and see how they can be better implemented, providing better access to different services for different. These are the more specific objectives that fall under those goals that really more directly relate to what we're going to be doing. So prevent sprawl, redevelopment, and compact infill, that pedestrian-oriented design, which I was touching on in those earlier service communities. So something like range of housing types could very direct relationship to how we're doing the land development code in terms of ensuring that the setbacks, the lot sizes allow for different types of housing and don't assume that all housing will come in one of a small number of product types. And so allow those product types, but not necessarily assume that everything has to be that. I already talked a little bit about transportation and sustainability would also be an independent factor in terms of things like land. And then preservation and protection has more to do with what we're not building. So the land development code does touch on that. Some have a sub-consultant in the horn that can address those, but most of our focus is going to be our changing and our developing and how that happens. Questions so far? We had two on the way. So in terms of the actual update, so we talk about what's the purpose of coding in general. What is the purpose of the update? The update is to deal with changes in the comprehensive plan. So that's comprehensive plan. Then we'll need to change changes to reflect that. Sometimes that's very specific in terms of there are new future land use districts that didn't exist prior. Those will have to be correlated to new code. And some of it is more actual, to the extent that the emphasis of the code has changed, or something like more mixed. How do you make sure that the code encourages as opposed to searches or puts up barriers to mixed use development? We also look around at the physical context, and part of our scope is to look deep and see how the physical environment accommodates or doesn't accommodate different types of land development code change. Planning industry continues to change and learn and grow and up to date with national best practices. So those into the land development code, and that includes both just improvements on how we create people as well as incorporating things like new technology, long time writing standards for electric vehicle parking, which I'm not a specialist in, but I think I am now. And also that means refining processes and standards. And that's one of the places, not the only place, but one place this committee can add a lot of value in terms of what is or isn't working today, both in terms of the types of buildings, places, sites that the code is producing, and in terms of the process, to the extent that there actually are code users, that the process gets you there works well or doesn't work well. So what do we anticipate will be changing? We did but I think you got this last time, the spread showed specifically which chapter that we anticipated would have high change, medium change, some sections of code that won't change much. And there's, so to the extent that new zoning districts are added, obviously are new material or significant rewrite. A lot of that has to do with the new future land use districts that have been together. We anticipate that will be primarily targeted redevelopment areas. This map is actually, and it's oriented around transportation, but it does a really good job calling out those areas that are targeted for the biggest change within the code. So the downtown, both the downtown core areas and the downtown transition area, the Oviedo Mall, and the Gateway West core. And I know that more complex the West Central Hammock area, but all of these areas are areas where what's on the ground and what's permitted by the future land use district are quite different. So those are the areas where we would expect change. And then you see a lot of yellow. There's a lot of area where there may not be a lot of change. Another area that has been identified as making significant changes is the waters. That's something that we're very familiar with. And the approach to landscaping in a lot of Florida communities historically has been about keeping things apart. It's about how to buffer, how do we screen, how do we make sure we don't see, and to the extent we start to talk about compact infill and mixed use, certainly parts of our neighbors we don't want to see. We don't want to see garbage cans, some parking areas, but it becomes more about how do we make a pleasant walk from the community apartments or the subdivision next door, rather than how do we keep things apart. And again, we're talking about new development, so we're not necessarily talking about existing neighborhoods, which will maintain whatever sort of screening buffers they have now. As new development comes in, how do we create great landscape for people to actually spend time rather than just to serve an aesthetic purpose of masking development that we don't want. And then the last slide here on this topic, a few times already about multi-mobility and transfer, how buildings and building sites get designed on transportation. Are the doors oriented towards the public sidewalk? Are there direct walking connections between, but also the actual, on larger sites, new street or essentially driveways that serve as streets will get built by development. So how do That's primarily where the street standards come in. We're not how the city builds streets, that the public works department is for. We need standards for when developers build streets, or also if they're rebuilding a sidewalk or on an existing street, how does that happen based on the densities that are going to be there? Another specific change that we're anticipating is the addition of standard dwelling units. The city also already has existing architectural and urban design standards, but we understand there's a need for some updates to that lighting standards. And there's going to be some interesting things we can talk about with lighting technology and how to maintain it. Now, what's not changing? It's helpful for us to focus our efforts on the things that are significantly changing, whereas identifying the things that are not changing is equal. So the conventional residential districts, many of which are already built, not a lot of need to focus on changes to those sections, as people like what they have now and they don't want to change it. Not a lot of vacant land that is going to be developed under those categories. Similarly with rural, industrial, and mobile home districts, we don't expect a lot. We hear massively different feedback. Process will kind of depend on what we hear. So if the process is today are working well, it may not be a lot of change, but if we hear concerns about the process, and there may be new processes associated with new districts. So I want to talk a little bit about the best ways to provide input. A big document out there, the Land Development Code, we're talking about how change, and you can start sending me red lines tomorrow about every word we want changed, and I want to make sure that we're aligning the input with the kind of changes that we expect. So that's where that matrix really will come in handy. Also, our continuing conversation with staff, and so first off, any changes have to be consistent with the vision of the conference. That is our guiding document. That's our set of givens that we want to or not, and that's what we deal. If that isn't consistent with that, then we're not able to use it. The next piece is the appropriate level of detail. So if we're talking about sections that aren't changing a lot, there may still be refinements that could be made to those sections. That's where, gosh, this setback that's 10 feet really should be 12 feet, and this residential that's not going to change very much, but maybe we can make this. That's an appropriate kind of feedback for that section. But if there's writing, then that fine-grained level of feedback is not going to be the best use of your time, because I'm going to give you a whole new chapter that looks completely different. So for those sections, we will put forward higher level concept and consensus on those higher level concepts before we start writing the details. Another area that's important for us to understand is there are different people with different perspectives on this. It would be great if everybody agreed on everything, but that would be the first committee I've ever seen where that was the case. So it's important for us to know what are areas of consensus and what are areas of divergence in opinion. So if it's a strong consensus, that gives us very clear direction on how to move forward. It's an area of concern or divergence where people have different perspectives. For us to understand those different perspectives, and we may have some solutions as the best practices on how to find a middle ground or help address some of the concerns of one side or the other, all that. The other thing I'd encourage you to do is don't just look at the document, look at the city that you see in front. And it's a little more complicated than that, because different things were built at different times. It's helpful to us if you let us know newer development, what you think well and what didn't work so well. What type of built environment is, and in some cases that may be a built environment that didn't result in the code. It may have resulted directly from the code as it is written today. It may have resulted from something like development, but it may have characteristics that we can make part of the code. So looking at the good examples of this is a great development that did a good job that we want to replicate is helpful to us. It either tell us great or it's standards that we can incorporate. And as well as the reverse, something that we don't want to replicate. So what do we do with that? This is one piece of the puzzle, so we also will be getting from staff, we'll be getting feedback from workshops, ultimately getting feedback from the planning and zoning. We'll be combining all of that into ultimately a draft of the new. As I said, for areas of bigger change, start that draft with ideas, maybe some drawings, bullet point level discussions of what we anticipate being part of that before we go drafting something that can be legally enforced with all the details. That helps us make sure we're going the right direction before we set time to do the details. And lastly, just order the process. Right now we're in code and just the comprehensive plan, but the city also has other plans, transportation, et cetera, that are informing what we do. Of course, feedback from this committee, which will be, could be early in the process and also late in the process. And then we'll start, once we have that base, we'll start actually drafting concepts and specific revisions to the code. There's 3 drafts in our contract, one for staff in this committee, and then the subsequent drafts will go to this committee as well as the LPA and City Council. That is, if I know that is, that's the main part of my presentation.
Sort of a general comment slash question. So I see a lot of governments implementing this process of let's get rid of some of these driveways. While at the same time, they're wringing their hands and wondering, some of these design things can drive up costly, which kind of shows affordability, which is another goal of the company. We should, have you look at those
More
values.
lines, but maybe a higher elevation picture. I think planning is very important for a city. I think the parameters, of course, we don't want adult entertainment next to a site next to residential. I get those types of uses. But I don't know how to get the input from people who've been on the other side, work their way through this zoning code, or the stakeholders that have had to push through that. I know there's 3 of us sitting here right now. We can't discuss outside of this room how we would like to see changes done. Instead of listening to planners tell us how these revisions, how do we make a point where, hey, when I work through the process, I tried to save these trees, but your code scratched that. After 60 days of going through, I said, okay, pull those 3 trees out. Oh, no, that's not the intention of the code. That's how it's written. So, and I don't think anybody who's not a stakeholder who has walked through this process, how difficult, daunting it is. I've worked through more than a dozen municipalities, less than 2 dozen municipalities in the state of Florida, and this one is right up there with one of some of the most difficult. And I've worked through the county. So I'd like some, how can we tell you, hey, this is what we saw?
I think that is section or some of those, this is the way developers are interpreting it versus where can you come to a consensus to make it easier to get to that section. That's where we'll get that input.
So our inputs only when we get the specifics.
Well, that's
I think,
Well, so the next section, I'm going to ask you some questions.
I think instead of revisions, we need to look at rescissions. There's a lot of.
Obviously, one of the reasons that the council decided.
Oh, I don't expect you to.
But usually, my experience, when we decide on how to form a committee, we say we want to visit, we want those comments. That's what the council does. That's the job of this committee, to come up with a consensus, much like the.
So I guess my question is, rather than listen to the presentation of planners, how can we present? Do we have to wait and just take pot shots as law, or can we give you an overall?
The way we're going to go through it.
I might like this next section, because I do want to, again, I think we, as I mentioned earlier, we have different levels of familiarity with the code, so some people are already very strong opinions, and some people are going to get into the process. And we can excel with levels of comment in terms of this line in the code causes big problems. We need to, and we can also, you can give us problems and we can propose solutions. So at a level, the code says, or the comp plan says we want to take a better way of doing that. So depending on level of familiarity with the code, it sounds like your level is pretty high. You can either propose very specific changes, or holler at us, and we can try to solve it. And the other thing, if you don't give me your bad jurisdiction codes, but if you've got some examples of things you think work well, specific code sections or language, okay, and we can incorporate those. And I know, I'm sure we will have some written comments as part of this process. I don't necessarily want you to send your whole red line tomorrow because we're not there yet. But I think we will need to take input. And depending on the level of interest of the whole committee, we're talking about values. I think it's something that's important to discuss as a committee. Line item changes, we can determine whether it needs to come back to committee, question of what the impacts will be. So, that was the me talking at you part. So now, we're a half hour in. So I wanted to propose some questions process if folks are ready to answer these right now, or specific folks don't feel. But these are the questions that I wanted to talk through based on what I see in terms of the city's goals, as well as some general questions that we want to deal with. So I will defer to the chair on have a question or through each member.
I'm going to defer it back to you.
Okay.
To what is best.
Well, let's try going through the first question. And so the first question is, how is the land development code today, what goals of code supporting infill and development, which includes the two pieces. Mainly that's focused on the new downtown and the old downtown. So if those answers are different, if we're doing a good job of that right now, then we just go from like.
Tore down the old downtown, there is no old downtown. I mean,
Are we going in a circle?
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, more than that, or?
creating a new downtown. So, do we not want to support walkability and multi-mobility? We're not jumping it out yet?
well, we can,
How do you want to do it?
well, we're trying to go through one at a time,
Okay.
so if you want to.
And then creating a new downtown, to my opinion, is the land planner's design of what a multi-ghetto downtown would be.
Do you have these specific design changes that would make that different, or is it mainly general
But
about the
it-
idea of having
It gets to supporting the walkability and multi-mobility, which is the next question.
so we'll get to that on the
it's
next
tied
question.
there.
So it's kind of an unfair question for me,
Okay.
for the client. And I work with a lot of recognition that the existing comprehensive plan and henceforth the code is really difficult. So I think there's a lot of effort, and part of what this committee will do is to be like, I'm here, is to work specific. So I'll say that the existing code is devoid of visions don't make a whole lot of sense. But I think you've recognized work, and we're going to have probably new posters.
Old downtown.
I'm talking, well, really, that's where my job is, but say Oviedo on the Park's almost done. So there's a few things we can nibble around the edges on, but there's only a couple of vacant pieces there. So really, that's not what I would say is my concentration. Part of what happened in Oviedo on the Park was based on economics. Go back, and you mentioned when things occurred, and that was a very different time. Some of it's occurring now, but the state was things from then. Let's work towards.
So now if you could pull the microphone.
I think by and large, the process the city is going through is part of improvement from the past. I see 2 or 3 areas that could be improved. But first, we need just putting redevelopment and infill. That is basically to developers. I didn't see much proactive approach, kind of open the door for the developer comes and presents. When he comes and presents something, maybe we can do something and have it minor. There is a good improvement in supporting the walkability and
And I just want to mention, just because the other two gentlemen, we're going to come back to those second bullets. We'll come back.
Alright, so as far as reviving the historic downtown, because of the DOT project, right? So we're buildings for the road, really need to envision what that old downtown is going to make sure the land development code sets those standards so that redevelopment doesn't look like. And then I agree with Mr. Axel about how much you can do in that area. So I'd really like to see some focus on the historic downtown.
What would you like to see change? What is the thing that could be improved in the new downtown and the old downtown? Is more density, that's the complaint has. What is missing?
So if that area is supposed to be mixed use downtown housing, that's missing. I mean, yeah, that's true. You probably could go up 1 or 2 stories and talk about affordable housing. So being able to provide that kind of housing for students, that would be, I would really like to see that. That's what a historic old downtown to me signifies. So does it have to be what is Oviedo? No, it can reimagine.
I think a big change that's good is, by doing this, the pre-design development code compartmentalize that whole area. there's so many different overlays and things that are gone, so that's good. I'm just gonna remove that word historic from any of this discussion in reality, because although, you know, my first home is historic at this point because it's more than 25 years old by the state of Florida. So any home over 25 years old is historic. There was no history. There was no, those buildings were older, they were there, but the significance was minor at best. So when people get caught up in the historic part of the word, it just, you know, the roadways, the design had to go. So we're moving forward versus getting caught up in that word historic. I think as I think Mr. Nassar was pointed out, looking at a vision, a larger scale vision. I think we have, council has talked about the word vision, and it's kind of a loose, but I think he's looking at a more definitive term of vision. Is what does the city like, you know, what's a drawing look like? What is a painting? Give me the, you know, how it really connects, you know, that kind of stuff versus, yeah, we've got the words and the looseness, but a deeper thought into what a vision is of the overall of the city and how this area and south of this area really connects. You know, I'm going to say to the word for the mall. You see this, there's this left turn out there, there's this armway that goes to the mall. And, you know, it's a separate land, world, and whole region that's close by, but keeps being brought up in terms of how it works towards this whole thing. It doesn't if it doesn't. If there is no real connective way that it puts together. So I think, you know, Sam was really talking about what's the vision of the infill? What's the vision of 434 outside of, you know, we talk about that one area, but let's just go the other side of 434 east on those homes that are going to redevelop. How does that really happen? What is that going to look like? You know, years ago, some of them are already, I'm going to say the word McMansion, people have built big homes on small lots, tore down. And how do we envision that really progressing as part of this? Density, you know, definitely needs to be a much denser area. Up and I call it what it wants to be called, is the Water Tower District, but up there, you know, that it needs to be a higher density. But as a design, I'm going to say the word flaw, or it's a flaw in my opinion. You know, you look at the original pictures and images of Oviedo on the Park when it was coming on board. We can't get away from the fact that people drive. You have to get here to walk here. You have to get here to be here. How do you park? Where do you park? That's, it's not a huge problem, but if it's perceived as a huge problem, it's a problem. People perceive that there's no parking, it's hard parking, it's terrible parking to get out of the park. We have a big parking lot right there that's, you know, yes, you may have to walk 100 yards more or 20. I don't get around that, but perception becomes the reality. That people like, it's a pain to park there. But, you know, those are the things I kind of look at as not what's flawed, but what we have to really look at as the design progresses. Because again, design, look at that original design, it mimics it very well from the first iterations in 2002, 3, 4, whatever. But I think the changes were significant.
And when I think about how the LDC is doing for downtown, I think about back when like the first 300 people where downtown proper is today hit the ground there, what it might have looked like, and how it changed with those first 300 people, and how it looks today with how many go through there, 30,000, you know, in the greater Oviedo area or more than that, and how different it looks. And that's the one constant, right, that we all know is change. And I do look at things like, you know, being able to go take my kids to the townhouse, which that change is the constant, and where they've been relocated for what I'd say is the greater good. And how they took some of the architectural elements of their building, the sign and stuff like that, and built it into their building that keeps some of that. And I think to how that continues, and, you know, my 11-year-old would recognize that same signage and all. That keeps the charm and keeps some of it while also allowing that business to grow. You know, you got Kelly's Ice Cream right around the corner there, and it's changed, but has it necessarily changed for worse without losing its charm? I would say no. So that change that we would see in that downtown area, you know, as long as there are some architectural things that, you know, look back on historical and maybe build in and keep some of that charm that the downtown have been in for, but ultimately.
Historic downtown is gone. Concern I have is historic downtown was the place everyone drove through. They just drove through the historic downtown. My hope is that we will come up with a way to influence the new downtown so they're not just driving, and a way to connect so that people don't have to rely as much. And making it safe for people to
My major concern, we know that change is gonna have to happen. It's gonna happen. It's inevitable. I grew up in Oviedo. I'm a native Oviedo. Probably like, so historical part that's no longer there. That never was. To me, the post office was right on the corner. I know the road had to go, you know. So to say that to me as a native Oviedo, that had some value to me. Just my personal opinion. But we know that we need the road. I don't want to wait 4 hours like the other time I was late to the meeting because ducks and the chickens wouldn't let me cross the road. I mean, I'm being honest about it. So where do we find the balance? You know, that's where I'm at with this. I think we have to look at but at some point, when we redevelop the historic downtown, that we put some features in there that reminds people that Oviedo was an old farm community. Not just put it on a sign with 30 oranges growing there, but put something where they can feel where they have like a general store type of feel. So with that, but then with the new, I'll leave it at that. But with the new development, creating the new downtown, which is, I had an interaction, I know Dave probably remembers, I had a parcel of land here that I own. Even before that, I had an issue when they were developing, when they were conceptualizing, when the first development, I had some concerns about the setbacks and the density council. I actually did a presentation on that. To know that I would ever, have to use that at some other point, but those were some concerns just as a general resident that I had about those things. Well, those concerns were actually in my ears. So at this point, I'm on a committee whether I think that people will listen to those things and we can do something about that. That's why I'm really here. I've been knocking on, even with a little issue that I have, with a little parcel that I have, I've been down to the land, members on several times, just, hey, what do I do about this? What do I do about that? What do I say? And if a layperson doesn't feel comfortable with knowing what the code says or how it works, then I think we're just spinning our wheels. I'm not an expert at land. No, I've been to Dave's office a couple times and just see what he does and say, man, well, how do you do this stuff? You know, I can't figure it out, but I'm trying to learn and want to get input to as far as make. I love Oviedo. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. I think we've got to come up with some kind of balance. And I know that historic is gone, but the element of that, she said, let people that we can't, we add value to something, and a lot of residents who still live here. Of course, there's more anger than actually live here now. That's all I have.
For timer bullets, we want to get through everything, and let's at least start 2 minutes. And then if you haven't been able to say everything you want, by the time we get through everything, then we can come back around if there's not our own cut.
I think it probably would be efficient if we just had people go through all the bullets.
So I'll give you 3 minutes.
Okay. Supporting walkability and multi-mobility. I think that's kind of a misnomer. And until you deal with sunshine, air conditioning, and the automobile, you people are, there'd be me and Mr. Jackson living here in Florida if it wasn't for air conditioning, because it's insufferable. He walked that much. There is a good point to try and get traffic off those, but I think that's going to come with technology, and not just in self-driving cars, but also home. We saw that through the COVID pandemic, and I actually went to try and find some traffic counts, and it looks like everything's plateaued or gone down since COVID, which is interesting because it means people more can work from home. So you don't need an office building, you don't need to live near an office building, so maybe you don't have to commute there 2 or 3 days a week. So I think that if you try and force everybody to walk or ride their bike right now, you're barking up the wrong tree, because I think our technology is going to develop and our real estate is going to develop a little bit faster than that. So the attractive places, you guys have done a great job with that, creating functional, attractive landscapes. I think that we can simplify the code there. I think that we can say, hey, you have an end, you need 37 trees, put them where you want. Processing development applications is slow. We need help on that. I know one of the things we touched on in a previous meeting is architecture for commercial buildings. If we have architectural guidelines, why do we need to go in front of city council to delay our development process to do that? And the last time I was in front of council, there's no design professionals who sat on council, so why are they doing that when there's staff here that are design professionals and can say, yes, what's missing from that list from the code? I think the code needs to be cut in half. And it can be simplified with overarching guidelines and giving staff some autonomy to make the calls on these issues and get the process moved along. It's taken me in 2 projects I've taken through here, it's taken over a year to get through zoning. One of them was an existing building, doing an existing business in the city of Oviedo across the street, and it took me over a year to get that. Another one, it's very costly, I don't know if you all know this, the little bitty building that I built, less than 3,000 square feet, commercial building on Mitchell Hammock Road. I spent $106,000 in impact fees, building permit fees to the city and state before I ever stepped on the ground. That's before I paid an architect, that's before I paid an engineer, $106,000 for something that's about the size of everybody's house in here. That's really, really costly. If you're asking small businesses to come into this town, that's a huge, huge step to jump over. Mom and pop, before you buy your first set of silverware, before you buy a pizza oven, you gotta give the government $106,000. That's a heck of a threshold to cross. Okay, I'm done.
So supporting walkability and multi-mobility, I think we have to have a split personality of Oviedo. Most of it's already here, and most of it's suburban sprawl. Most everybody, including people like me who actually live and have a choice. The idea is once you get somewhere, you can walk within a limited area without getting in your car every 5 minutes to go to this door, this door, this door. If it's raining, you won't. If it's 100 degrees out, you won't. But I'll tell you, I like going on little craft beer expeditions. In St. Pete, we can walk. There's certain places, you're going to drive to a spot and walk to a few places, and it just makes life more enjoyable to live. Producing attractive places, that's really tricky because beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I believe that the current architectural standards sometimes create compliance that's I'm not sure exactly how to address that, but it's something we have to grapple with. As far as functional, attractive landscapes, I think we restricted this out of the code. One big thing there is you can't have the same quantity of, it just doesn't work. We need to recognize how to do this. Development applications, I completely agree, doesn't need to go to boards, shouldn't go to boards. A lot of staff time. When Oviedo on the Park first was created, politicians didn't like it, it changed. Part of this committee, hopefully we can grapple those things back, a little more leeway at the staff level. Stop this sitting around in circles for months writing reports to have as 8 people passing judgment on architecture. And I think that stuff just passes on, wasting 2 months. What's missing from this list? Well, I'm a firm believer, not relying on the code as written, but going through it with a little bit of a zero-based idea. If this section of the code, if this part of the code isn't achieved, benefits, toss it. You know, there's some examples I won't get into now of absolutely psychotic things, some of which reside in the and, you know, engineering standards manual or otherwise, you should really just say, this is crazy, this serves no purpose, toss it. You know, I'm familiar with the process, I don't know if you're involved in Seminole being bogged down in La La Land, and I'm not saying that, just watching that, it's like nibbling around edges. I think we need to look at this a little more.
Let me just, because that was brought up, let me make a comment that very different scope than this one. This was scoped as right of the entire code, whereas
Right.
that is scoped as very targeted changes to an existing code.
I
So,
think supporting walkability, and I think the city is doing a good job. I mentioned that the city required fair with villages. In my mind, all the residents there, they're not going to drive to go to Sprouts to walk, because that's a nice street. You just go by the grocery, that reduces traffic on the roads. It is walkability. We should create more space, but when possible, we should productive, producing attractive places. That's also the same thing. That was required to have larger big areas, and instead of segregating a small one, they were congregated together, which creates a variety. What can be done? Functional and attractive, doing a job, just continue in that processing, development, application. I think the city is doing it. There are areas of it. Not everything has to go to the board, to the council. Where possible, let's shorten the period and simplify the process so approvals can be. What is missing? I think we should touch more on standards and make the standards simple, follow and implement. For example, I mentioned that I was required to plant 7 trees. How does it mean 7? Especially when the lot 5,000 square feet. You can't plant 7. We should simplify the code where when it is not possible, we should work with the homeowner. We don't need to plant 7 trees in this lot.
So, I feel like supporting walkability all tied together in my mind. So you're going to support walkability that are comfortable with the pedestrian environment. Like Sam's comment about the new developments that are play where you can park and then you can access on walking through an entire parking lot and then walking down. Also having that green space, so you're visiting these stores, don't get tropical smoothie. You want a place to sit down and enjoy that instead of suburbs, maybe incentivized. So I think those really tie together and go back to my comment of, especially in the mixed use, creating the walkability and connections, rich out the landscaping. So that's better as far as attractive places. I go back to redeveloping the Milk District, not Milk District. Water Tower, sorry. I really ended. Creating that as an attractive place with your landscape, with your architectural code, realizing new historic downtown. So I think all of that really needs to be looked at together. Processing development applications, I will lean on my board members for that. I do think that if there are items that don't need to go, they're hired, they represent Oviedo. I think we can really help to this group, there's an improvement. What's missing from the code? I'm sure Steven's going to take a deeper dive into the code readiness, things like that. So I'll ask.
Walkability, well, first I'll say, you know, somebody realized the word historic is all against. I think as it was said, the townhouse made it, the beautiful thing is how you redevelop things and keep that feel for that area. That's the whole goal of all of it. Walkability, I think we've, in this area, and even right here, you see a lot of people walking across the street to go to Oviedo Park. We've done a much better job lately, multi-mobility, but I also will at the same time say, the most latest study that came through and showed us all of this, every connectivity issue that was put up became a political nightmare, and people are against, not my neighborhood. So, that's where it hits the wall. I look at what's the right thing to do, and I wish those guys would actually would have presented it that way versus one of 43 people at a meeting dot as their choices. What's the right thing to do? How should this connectivity happen? And if you want to make that decision as council, I was up there, so I know, that's not, then you're tasked with facing that lament and going, oh, it's a tough decision. There's the right way to design this and what we're going to do instead. But, I think we, as, should look at that kind of direction as what should be done. What's the right thing to do? And present that to council and give them, listen, hard choices are hard choices. That's what you get paid for, Give them the hard choices to make and make decisions between them and PGA or LPA to go through and say, well, this is how we're going to navigate those decisions. But we, have to walk that line of what should be done. Reducing attractive places, it's pictures sometimes. We were presented with a lot of pictures. Oviedo in the Park is one of them. There's a beautiful picture. I'm not going to say that the picture of the apartment looked a heck of a lot better than when they went up. And I'll say everybody, I won't speak for staff, but the council made it from the dais that like, wow, the picture looks really, really darn good. It just doesn't look as good in person. So I don't know if that's, like a date site. You have a picture up there, the picture looks really good, you meet the person and figure out, wow, is that a 10-year-old picture? Well, I think Oviedo in the Park looked like a 10-year-old picture when it went up. Not that it doesn't look bad, it just, sometimes the images that you look at, and it matches. You can look at it and go, damn, it matches everything on that picture. So I think when we look at the standards and what we're actually looking at, understand that sometimes the image that you're looked at in the picture doesn't translate sometimes to the finished product. Look at the finished products around here. And anywhere you are, look at the finished products. We're going to get high densities coming to that area. It's going to be multi-level, multi-story. So what do you like when you go look around? Find the stuff you think really looks good. Take a picture, notice it, take an address, and go, this is, they did a great job of, there's 5 different colors, 3 different, textures, select all this kind of stuff, and they did it really well. Because like I said, sometimes the picture just doesn't portray itself when it comes to the end. Functional attractive landscaping, sometimes, we have to make sure that it's doable, that it's workable, and that it's sustainable. I'll use that word, from a functionality and a cost perspective for whoever's maintaining it, whether it's the city, in this image, so to speak, or the landowner, that it becomes something that we're not just overtaxing them on a pretty picture in the beginning, and then we've all seen corners in here that, as the years go by, that edge starts to look a little scraggly, and suddenly we're disappointed in how it looks. How can we make that code that it does those things? Application process time, I'll just agree. We need to do better, period, end of sentence. I think that's one of the biggest things that everybody's going to always ask for. As far as time frame, how the process works. Again, I think it's the pendulum swings. There's percentages out there. I think you guys can do 10% staff. 20%. This is 20% deviation that staff can do. So you start looking at these raw numbers and go, staff can do 20. It doesn't get to council until 30.
No. So for site plans, anything above 20 goes to council.
There used to be different, the levels used to be more. So I think, again, it's the pendulum kind of, council went and took a little bit back. They reeled back in. But you start looking at this percentage and say 20% of X. Staff has the right to just pencil it right off. You have to start realizing what that number equates to. Yes, when you look at homes, sometimes 20%, that could be a 1.5-foot deviation on a side setback. I have to go, to council because of that. That's ridiculous in every way, shape, and form. But you start looking at 20% deviation, 19.9 deviation on something larger. So it's something I think we really have to look at and talk. But I agree with them. They've got they got reeled back in. It used to be another step in between this PZA could approve at different level. So how that gets done, the process, I think is something that we definitely have to think about and work out, because it definitely is not right now. And that 20% is probably a good number, but where that actually applies, I think we may have to look at different places on how that applies versus just the blanket area that we've done currently.
I don't know what much more to say beyond the heavy hitters that have went before me, but I'll just echo some of their thoughts. One, that something that I spent quite a bit of time through 4 years working for the Florida Nursery Growers and Landscape Association, and exactly what you said. It's amazing when you're working in that industry and you see this freshly planted, beautiful greenery, and then there's no continued maintenance regulation. And selfishly, I feel like that should be in there to help support our nursery industry out there as well, to continue their viable operations. But it happens all across our state. It's real, and we could be a spotlight on how to change that going forward. But also, I think back to walkability and multi-mobility. Many moons ago, I lived for summer up in Arlington, Virginia, and I didn't want to go anywhere outside of walking distance from where I was at because, one, traffic was horrible, and then they had bigger issues or bigger solutions like subways and all that good stuff. But I think about the times that I've been in those places and when you were walking and we are, all addicted to our air conditionings and how that flows over into our landscaping, and not necessarily that there's a hedgerow of oak trees, because I am for the nursery industry, but at the same time, there's no reason why we should have some. And you think about like walking around Savannah and stuff like that, there's not hedgerows of oaks, they're strategically located with a thought process of how those oaks are going to grow, be growing 50 years from now and providing, the right kind of shade versus oaks planted that then choke each other out or are not going to be viable, for the life that they should be able to live, and then the benefits that they can provide to the walkers and the community and all. So I just think about that and tie that into some of the things we've already said, attractive places. I've already talked about that. You've heard me say that. Just if you want the charm, study the history and try to help put some of that into the areas. I look at things like naming an area, the Water Tower District, when it's downtown like that, and then how you can play some things into that. But I do think with the density side of things that we're going to get some walkability, making it right, how they're going to get there. And development applications, I think, working with staff, a few different staff over the couple years I've been dealing with the city here, it's a tough job, and I've seen things improve, and that's not necessarily from the people standpoint, and it's all about people, process, and product, right? And that the famous Marcus said. I think we've got some really good people now, and then just nailing the processes down where they're improved to garner a better product for everyone.
Walkability, we know Oviedo has a low walkability, so that's another thing that seems non-existent. But growing up in Oviedo, there was a time when people could walk safely, and so hopefully this process will help support that, to increase the walkability score. And then thinking about the development where we're able to, as much as we can, suggest the development that's going to, be home to people who want to walk, and we give them jobs in that spot where they, so they're able to walk that downtown corridor. To me, would be a good idea. We have sprawl in Oviedo, so it's sort of coming close that for the development will sort of encourage what we're claiming we want, which is the ability and some affordable housing. If we're able to come up with those codes must support that, you know. So maybe being more strict with those incentives, so that we actually get what we're looking for in Oviedo, to support the community. Those would be my things. I don't know anything about the development applications. Then, my other thought was, again, where we're talking about, places, is we, you know, sort of, we're working to bring in, say, the, UCF graduate, to kind of like that they're a couple campus, and we create spaces that support that, where we're not putting more cars, but we're giving them live, and making it connected. There are people that, are not car dependent, and we're sort of cutting them off in their neighborhoods. Those places. Oh, and I was to say, the landscape can support that. You know, so they're safe on that, and the native trees that will provide all of that's possible. It just seems like we put that in as it's a dream, and with the code we can push more of a what are my thoughts?
And I think that we need that, I think we probably explore that. I mean, that area, people that don't live there, can just, I mean, you don't have to go, spots, but, you know, you can walk in public, you know, you go right across the street, public, you can walk there. I live in an area where I can't walk from there to the grocery store. I get that. But multi-mobility, I think that's needed a lot more than we put emphasis on, because, like you said, everybody's not gonna walk, everybody's not gonna, we don't have enough other transportation sources, I think. And that's a bus in my area now, you know, one way, you know, get on the bus for 2 days or whatever. They have it, you know, but it's not real function. And that's the user man in the community, which like a lot of them, they walk, because of the business. And they don't have any other way except for links bus or, you know, this is attractive places. I think we do a lot of that. I think we, more trees, but then, like I said, you can't plant a live oak and expect, I mean, a lower oak and expect it to last 150 years. They're not gonna do it. I had a prize great bird I had for a little baby. The fungus got on there and died, you know, but the other one's looking good. So you gotta be able to do that. And with the guys with the attractive plastic, you gotta put the right plan in. Well, no applications, I haven't had development, but when I did an addition or whatever. But actually, I reached on that when I'm trying to think of doing some additions tonight. So I kind of get the feel of that now, of what the process is like. So, and I haven't had any personal problem with that. What's missing from the list is kind of what she alluded to and what Dave alluded to is, and one of the reasons, the workforce or affordable housing. I mean, Oviedo is a city, but there's no real affordable housing. It's just cost to live. We want people to come here that, you know, that just have a regular job. We gotta do some incentive to the developers and with the city to come up and say, okay, we can do this. I know they have to redo project, which was I call it. But, you know, that's not enough affordable workforce housing to and to college, you can't afford to go out and buy it for it. I would want to. I wouldn't want that much of a debt. So we figure out a way to, you know, build some $200,000. It's attractive to the developer to build those houses. We just got to look at, sometimes it's not easy, but we got to try to do what's right.
Active and to learn a little more about how you see that for the chair. It's appropriate.
It's too early.
So the next meeting, we're hoping, as we know, Michael Howard, I'm not sure if you know or not, Michael Howard resigned from the board. So we're in the process of trying to get someone else to replace him. So hopefully by the first or second meeting in September, we will have, so we are tentatively scheduling the next meeting for September 27th, which is a Tuesday. It should be at 5:30 and not 6 p.m. And one of the things that we're going to discuss at that time, as we're going to talk about tonight, is the process.
So the next item is discussion items. Are there any comments or announcements from any of them? With that, I'll go ahead and adjourn.
Did she confirm 5:30? Did you confirm 5:30?
Yes.
5:30 was probably you though, last time.
For me? No, I can.
Okay.
Thank you guys for starting late based on my schedule. I appreciate that. Staff.